Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hive Live. We are thrilled to officially launch this series dedicated to having approachable conversations on cybersecurity. So thank you for joining us. My name is Alex Nette, and today we have a very relevant and very topical roundtable lined up for you. We are talking about third-party risk. You may have heard about protecting the supply chain or even heard about SolarWinds and the hack and everything else around that in the news. But what does that mean? And more importantly, how could that impact your business and what can you do about it? Well, joining me today are two experts in the field. In full disclosure, they are both some of my former colleagues. We have Lydia Buffo and Priscilla Bowles. Priscilla is an experienced cybersecurity advisor at Deloitte, specializing in the development of cyber risk management programs. Previously, Priscilla was at Dominion Energy, where she assisted in developing and leading the company's third-party risk management program. She brings extensive insight into protecting organizations from supply chain risk in the continuously evolving cybersecurity landscape. Welcome, Priscilla.
Hi, thanks, Alex. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Lydia is an experienced risk management practitioner with over 33 years in information technology and cybersecurity sector. Before retiring back in 2019, she was an information security specialist at Dominion Energy and helped build and develop their third-party risk management program. This program helped reduce the third-party risk for one of the country's leading suppliers. Welcome, Lydia.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
All right. With that said, we're going to dive right into this. And I think the first order of business ultimately is, who are we talking about when we talk about third-party suppliers and the supply chain as a whole?
Yeah, when we talk about third-party suppliers, we're talking about any outside organization that accesses, processes, or stores any of your company data. And that can be anything as business privilege information or PII and PHI. And, many organizations tend to underestimate how many organizations they actually have processing, accesses, and storing their third-party data. That can be any organization from, someone who may print flyers for you that has your customer organization, or it can be your health benefits provider. It really is all across. Lydia, anything to add there?
Well, what I would add is sometimes you don't realize that it's just a small amount of information. You might just have somebody that has access to your system and all they're seeing is names, addresses, phone numbers, just information about individuals that could be your customers or your employees. And because it's not necessarily your social security number, sometimes you forget that that information is still private information.
Interesting. Yeah, when we're talking about that information, how might that be shared with some of those third parties? Is that something that continuously happens, or is it something that only happens one time? What does that generally look like, or what are some examples, more importantly?
It can be one time. It can be continuously. It can be information they're able to access through web portals. It could be third parties that have third parties working for them that they're not realizing have access to your information as well.
A real like third-party inception at that point.
Yes, yes. Yeah, it's very important when you do risk assessments and you're allowing a third party to store, process, or transmit any of your customer or employee data, that you look at every individual that has access and how they have access. They could be coming in as a third party to your third party to repair systems and still inadvertently be able to access that data.
Interesting. But that kind of creates like an endless cycle, right? If you have a third party who has a third party who has a third party, does it end up being your responsibility to maybe oversee or police the 6th, 7th, 8th third party? Or, what is kind of the ultimate way that you might have responsibility, or how do you digest a large problem like this?
Well, I would strongly suggest great contractual language between the third party that you have a contract with. You can also require that third party in that contractual language to let you know who they're sharing that data with. who is going to actually be the custodian of your data?
That is a great point.
Absolutely.
And we'll definitely come back to that from the contractual side and some of those pieces that go into that. One of the things I'm wondering about is from that side, we often bring in third parties to our company to help support us, whether it's to take care of a process that maybe we're not experts in, or to offload a process that maybe is not the most valuable use of our time. And especially for many small and medium-sized businesses, that might be the case. But why would we consider them a risk to our company if they're ultimately helping us?
You want to consider them an opportunity and a risk. That, like I said, their opportunity is there for them to help you save money, or be more of an expert in a process. But at the same time, they are a risk because if a third party has a breach of data that was entrusted to you by a customer or an employee, that reflects on you. You still have some liability there if a third party that has your data is breached. So that's why it is important to ensure that they are protecting your data just as well, if not better, than that you would yourself. And back to Lydia's point, and your point as well, Alex, yeah, we do see continuous cycles where you have fourth and fifth and sixth third parties, and you do have to put some bounds there. We recommend at least the third and maybe fourth party. It gets a little bit complicated as you go down the chain, but like I said, you want to make sure that you're understanding exactly who all has access in your data and doing as much contractually and assessment wise to make sure that they're protecting that as well.
I'd like to add one little tidbit. If what you really don't want is to read in the paper that there's been a data breach by a company, and you don't realize that that company has had access to your data.
Mm. Yep. I think that's one of the biggest things, right? You don't want to be a victim of finding out the news that might impact your company through the news. So yeah, I agree with that.
Exactly.
I think this brings up an interesting thing, as we're talking about contractual language and third parties and how we approach what the third parties are doing. Does everything always come in through the same kind of procurement cycle? Is this something that's a standard process that you can stand up and say, this is how we do this moving forward, or where might be those caveats or problems in that process?
Well, in my experience, sometimes you stumble across it just in a conversation with one of your coworkers that, oh, by the way, we're utilizing this little small SaaS company to do XYZ process for us. And it was, we swiped a credit card. We didn't have to go through supply chain to get to them. So, we didn't feel that we needed to utilize the risk assessment program on this third party. And so I think at that point it becomes very important. It's a teaching lesson at that time on your policies and procedures, and ensuring that everyone in the business units that seek outside help realize, what those policies are. And those policies have to state that what type of data, one of the first things in your risk management program would be to classify your data. And you need to get the word out to all your employees through policy what that classification table looks like.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good point, because especially for many larger companies now, you may have traditionally had spending limits, right, for when something needs to go through a procurement department or bringing it on. But in the era of SaaS-based solutions, and especially around IT, it's easy to take advantage of free things like Google Drive or Dropbox, or to swipe a credit card for a couple licenses, which might end up being just $5, $7, $9 per month, but put the data at risk. I think that's a great point. Of course, we're talking about SaaS-based solutions right now, but there are many other types of vendors and supply chain groups out there. You had mentioned a data classification policy. What are some pieces that maybe go into that, and how does that maybe influence working with and categorizing the risk around third parties?
Well, with your data classification, one, you have to understand what type of data your company has, their intellectual data, the identifiable information that the company has on either their employees or on their customers. And then you have to break it down because not all data is equal, not even all PII is equal. So you would want to classify your PII in kind of like a waterfall set situation where name plus social security, name plus credit card number, and sometimes not just name plus credit card number, but name plus credit card number and CVV code. So you have to kind of look at all the components of the data and look at what is going to put you in the highest risk from a financial standpoint of damage.
Mm-hmm.
Because with each data breach, there is a financial obligation, that a company will incur depending on how much data is leaked out.
We have said this a couple times now, PII. For those of the folks at home who do not know what that means, what is PII?
PII, yeah, I'll jump in here. PII is personally identifiable information, and that is any information that can specifically identify an individual. So in many cases, it's a name, first and last name, plus some other piece of data. As Lydia stated, not all PII is created equal. If you have a name plus a phone number, that's typically a lower level PII, but if you have a name plus a social security number, now you can do some real damage. And so that's going to be a higher level of PII.
Where does that include other like sensitive information like health information, or is that separate?
Health information is a category of PII. It's personal health information, PHI, and they have a lot of rules. The HIPAA rules are out there that a lot of the requirements for your PHI, and it is a category of PII.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So potentially for many companies, then even small and medium-sized businesses who have benefits providers for their employees and are supplying them with this type of information to include PHI, that's potentially a third-party risk to them, which I think is a huge thing that may go passed over. For many companies, I think it comes down to being able to maybe take larger providers at their word. Working with a reputable supply chain provider might be a way to mitigate the risk, but I think you both are right that doing your own due diligence and having your own data classification scheme can help better influence that and make sure that your data and your company's data is protected appropriately. Okay.
I'm sorry, Alex. I just want to add one other little item. The company that I was employed with could have PHI within their data as well when they were in certain areas of companies. If they do health checks like radiation limits on an individual, that can fall under that category. They do physical checks on your visual and whatnot just to make sure that you're fit for duty for the job that you're doing. That's also information that would be stored within your network or by the third party that is might coming in and doing that service for your company.
Priscilla, in your experience, what are some, I would say, unique examples of companies and data types that you may have seen out in kind of the wild? So companies you experienced as part of the supply chain or something that was interesting that you may not have initially thought of as a problem, but when it arrived on your desk, you were like, wow, that's a good one.
I think for me, one that sticks out is like health and fitness challenges. Especially in the new year, companies are typically motivating their employees by saying, hey, get a team together, sign up for this fitness challenge. And people aren't realizing they're maybe entering their age, their weight, their, some health conditions, to participate in challenges. And then there you are, something that seemed like an innocent, fun way to get people moving has some serious PHI as a part of the service. So I think that is one that myself and even the business stakeholders that I worked with, they were like, wow, I didn't realize all the things that go into that. Another good example are surveys. A lot of companies want to put out surveys to customers and employees, to gauge anything and be anonymous. So they typically, use a simple survey tool, and then they find out, wait, in order to have this, I have to send their name, their email address, and maybe even other pieces of information to get this survey back. Wait a minute, we need to take a step back here and let's evaluate doing that.
Yeah, and there's so many free survey companies out there now, Google surveys and SurveyMonkey and everybody else, and it's so quick to set something up and so easy to collect any information in those fields that you want. You're right that it puts that company and those information at a huge risk. Lydia, what are some weird ones that you saw, or some ones that you may remember as highlights because of how interesting they were?
Oh, one of my most favorite was this small company of about 4 to 5 employees who had absolutely no policies. They had no incident response plan in place. They did not run background checks on their personnel. They said they didn't need to because they did not have a turnover rate. They were very small. They were in just average little office space with no special cameras to check for security. Everybody had a key. Everybody had keys to the kingdom within their information. It was so small. They really didn't have per se a network set up, and they were housing some pretty critical data. Go into the details of the exact data, but I classified that data as high-level PII.
Mm.
And it was just eye-awakening because with our process for risk assessment of the third party, wherever we found a security gap, part of our requirement was that was to be remediated, and they just had no interest in remediation.
That is a perfect segue into my next question, because I think that from where we've started, we've talked about who is in the supply chain and who are third parties. We've also talked and looked at who has been kind of part of this scheme, what kind of data might be leaving and classifying it, which I think takes us to the bigger question, and we touched on a little bit earlier, which is how do you reduce risk? Is there a way to measure it, or kind of what are some of the best practices to get started on that process?
Well, first you have to identify your risk, and that is different at every organization. As we spoke on, once you have your data classification policy, then that will be the first step. And then following that, you can evaluate the risk assignment that you want to make towards the organization that is processing, accessing, or storing your data. Like I said, if it's something as business confidential, that's a trade secret that the third party may have, you want to classify them as high. And then, with that, there may be some additional questions or some additional assurances that you would want from them to prove that they are accessing your data, versus someone maybe, that could be a survey monkey where you provide email address and name, which is still sensitive, but not critical. Then you may say, hey, these people are medium and low, and I care, of course, about their data protections, but not as much as I care about my person that has my trade secrets. So I think that is a manageable way for most organizations to group their suppliers by risk and then assert the right level of effort to assess them.
Mm-hmm.
I think too, if I could add, at the end of the day, even with your smaller corporations, your lower level PII, lower level data, you just want to perform. There's not all risk assessments can be a cookie cutter, but there are some questions, some areas you want to look into that you'll look into for all levels of data. And you want to do that due diligence, because if there is a breach, you want to always be able to prove that you're a company that cares and that you've done your due diligence to protect the data.
I think that's a great point, because that due diligence and ultimately that goal of protecting the data probably has to create some sort of threshold, which I think really leads to how do we define what acceptable risk is then? How do we draw that line for acceptable risk? Is there too much data going out and not enough protection by a third-party company, or is the company not reputable? What are some examples of how you might start to be able to kind of draw that line for too far or just right?
Well, I would say if a company is only going to be storing, say, an email address, name plus an email address, certainly you're going to want, because we live in a time when encryption should be on any website. So if you're using some type of surveying company, they should have an HTTPS site. No question about it. The data should be encrypted. That kind of data, I would say you could let your reins down a little bit with where the data is stored. Some companies don't want their data stored in certain countries. Mm-hmm. So some data you might let your hair down on, okay, where they're allowed to store, or per se, individuals that support that company, where they're located and how they come into that company to look at that data.
So potentially it's a line that's defined by the business, but it may also be from outside influences too, maybe like compliance obligations as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Mm-hmm. I think this kind of comes down to what we were touching on earlier, which is ultimately, is it our company's problem that are running this risk management process, or is it the third party's problem? Where does kind of the problem lie, and how do we deal with it?
I think it lies with both, but most importantly, your company, again, if a customer or employee is entrusting that data to you, regardless of who ultimately had the breach, they're going to look back to you and say, why didn't you do your due diligence to ensure that my data was protected? But at the same time, third parties benefit from risk management as well. When I was assessing third parties' risk, because that third party wanted to do business with our organization, our results of our assessment, or the gaps that we found, helped them kind of go to their leadership and say, hey, this work, we really want to win. But they've identified some gaps, and they're saying we got to get these remediated in order to win the work. So they'll typically be able to push forward their security objectives as well as a part of us working with them for services. I've noticed, I've actually gotten thank yous from third parties before saying, hey, I've been wanting to do this for a long time, and because you identified it as part of the process, we got it done in my organization, so thank you.
Interesting. Yeah, that definitely makes me think of two things. I think you're right, it is both companies, and I do think it comes down to a reputational impact. While there's definitely some legalese, right, and lawyers could sit down and argue over what was in the contract and who was responsible for what, that's all great, but that's behind the scenes in a courtroom, and with maybe some payouts at the end for faults. But the public probably doesn't care. They only know that it was one large company, the one that they work with and have their data and signed up for, that had the problem. They don't care if it was a third party. And I think that's a great point. Priscilla, I think you bring up oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Alex.
No.
Let's talk on and on. I think also that third party, if you got to remember that they're marketing their services not to your, but to other companies. And I know, as Priscilla said, with the fact that the company that we worked for, we required that third party close the gaps on those security issues they had. We helped them write policies. I mean, we didn't write them for them, but we helped them. We gave them clues as to where they needed to beef up programs, where, what programs they needed to have in place. And it also made them more marketable. And when they have a breach, they lose customers too.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very important, and as Priscilla said, for them, and from a reputational standpoint for them, to be up to par and be at least have your benchmark for security meet a standard.
That is very interesting because, yeah, it points to something Priscilla touched on, which was that a company ultimately may have a driving business need to work with a third party. And so the business need may potentially outweigh the risk. And so if that business need might lead to greater revenue or an easier time managing some of their processes, even if there is some information security risk around that, it might be worth working with them to help them resolve those issues because the business need may outweigh where the risk stands at the beginning. And so you may have to help and work with them and can't necessarily write them off and find a more secure vendor. And you're right, having those data classification schemes and those risk assessments can help kind of lead you through that process. We just got a question in, and this actually ties directly to this, which is, what if a vendor doesn't know how to cooperate? What if they don't know how to respond to some of these security questionnaires, or they're not mature, like that one example that you gave, Lydia?
Well, generally, I was that assessor that worked hand in hand with them. I opened the communication lines, and I was there to answer their questions. Sometimes it's hard to understand a question on an assessment, as we all know. You don't really, and sometimes the third party doesn't have the appropriate individual answering the questionnaire. So you have to, it's always a teaching moment, I felt. Always trying to help them learn as much and have a full understanding of what your company's expectations are, as well as what the requirements are, because there are some state requirements for data protection. There's standards out there that are excellent, and a lot of companies require that you look up to, say, in this standard. You have to follow this standard. They set benchmarks. So
that is a great point, and kind of leads to my next question is, as we know, there are a wide swath of privacy requirements that extend across every state. There is no current federal mandate around that. What are some good examples then, as you're creating these third-party risk assessments and you're trying to measure and understand third-party risk, what are some examples of standards, or where could you start to try to create some of these?
Well, at Dominion, we looked around. We didn't necessarily use just NIST. We covered. I think at the time, last I checked, there were 47 or 48 state requirements for protecting PII, and we looked at the highest level of security that the state had, and then we looked at our data. And we built our data classification, and we had that waterfall of where we classified PII in four different levels, say, or three: medium, high, and low. Okay, and we built security practices that we didn't just go with the lowest benchmark. We wanted our data secured, so we met with our security architects, and we looked at what the security requirements were for that, the capabilities out there were. And that's how we built it.
And we keep mentioning PII, but yeah, this definitely, I think, all includes, again, other types of data, that the secret sauce of what your company does, right? There's specific things that may not fall under compliance obligation like PII, or things under HIPAA, or the credit card payment protection standards, but it may be the thing that makes your company unique, and something that if it fell into the wrong hands could cost you business or put you out of business. Speaking
business
of
privileged information at Dominion was equivalent to PII. We had 4 levels of data, and we had, there was PII, there was business privileged information.
And yeah, for a major provider, energy provider like Dominion Energy, yeah, that of course includes secret sauce that deals with nuclear plants and other things that would be not great to fall into nefarious hands. So yeah, I would think that would go on the same level as somebody's social security number.
Exactly.
And it could be argued, Alex, that some of the intellectual information a company holds from a financial perspective could do more damage having a breach in that area than a PII breach. PII is not absolutely the only important information that needs to be protected.
That's a great point. And talking about something topical too, if we think about something that there was a race to develop something that could potentially lead to multi-billion-dollar profits to be the first to market, the COVID vaccine might be a great example. It's just a mix of chemicals at the end of the day, but for a lot of these major pharmaceutical companies, it's a multi-trillion-dollar endeavor to be the first to market and be successful around that. So that would definitely be something else for a major company like a pharma company that would be important. But even, if it's a specific process that you as a smaller, medium-sized business have that makes you successful, it could just be a spreadsheet or something else that you have customers paying for that's worth protecting. Priscilla, what then are some examples of things that can go wrong at a third party and ultimately put your company at risk? You could give examples, but if they're sensitive, please don't do that.
Yeah, no specific examples, but a third party has the same risk that your organization has. That can be a accidental mistake by an employee who may fall victim to a phishing attack that may leave sensitive data on their desk, that may not lock the door behind them when they enter an area that has sensitive information. So all of the things that your organization can have that leads to information disclosure can happen at a third party as well. And then having assessed them properly to understand their processes, then you're left extremely vulnerable to those things because you don't know what they have in place to mitigate. They also have the same threat of insider threat. They could have someone maliciously giving information out or maliciously trying to sabotage the company. So they are subject to the same things that we are. They may be an expert in a specific process or service that they're providing you, but they are, a regular organization as well. So they are not immune to the threats that we are.
And I think that touches on two things too, that we've talked about previously, that there are different ways that ultimately, right, you could find out that something has gone wrong. You could find out through the news. SolarWinds is a great example where it was a massive third-party hack that wasn't necessarily disclosed by SolarWinds to its customers. And a lot of people found out through the news, unfortunately. But yeah, it could be something where you are notified personally if you're on a security team. But if you're a business support representative, you may be notified by the company that you normally work with that you have had a problem. And this touches on something, Lydia, that you mentioned earlier around having an incident response plan. What are people supposed to do with that information? And so if somebody who is maybe not a cybersecurity person or not an IT person gets notified about an incident, they really need to know where to send that information so that something impactful can be done about it. Many companies will have incident response plans that dictates things like what they need to do, maybe who they need to notify, if there are specific compliance obligations that they have to meet or risk major fines. That's a huge piece of the puzzle. I think that does come back to a little bit, Lydia, with what you were talking about earlier, which is a company too small to deal with all this? Or is there some size that you should start to look at this, or where does where's the line get drawn?
I don't think any company is too small to have an incident response plan.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people have them in their own homes. How are you going to react if your stove catches on fire? I mean, it's that simple. And also another piece is that I hate to go back to the contract language between the two entities, but if you do draw a contract, that should be notification of a breach is a very important section of a contract, and you should have that language there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Because just because it's in a policy that they have, they have no obligation to you to notify you just because it's in their policy. If they breach their own policy, that's not a big hit monetarily. A contractual breach is a big hit.
Mm-hmm. And Alex, to go back to your point on, small businesses and their security. So again, no business is too small to have some type of security practices. The way they accomplish a certain security objective may be different than a larger organization that has more budget, but there still should be a level of expectation that there is something that they can always do to improve their security. And we saw this a lot. And I think it's emerging even more now with a lot of organizations wanting to make a more concerted effort to work with minority companies and small businesses, especially during this time that, those companies tend to not have the big budgets for security. But again, it does not excuse them from making the best effort and making even just a small investment in their security, because ultimately, again, whether it's a small organization or large organization that ends up being the end of a breach for your organization, your reputation takes the hit. And so it's important to ensure that processes and controls are in place regardless of size.
Yeah, I think that's a huge piece of the puzzle, right? Is that there's no business that is too small or too big. I do think it does become a scaled effort, right? For larger businesses, their incident response plan is going to be longer because they have more things that could go wrong. I think their third-party risk assessments are going to be more diverse or verbose because there's more things that they were looking out for. So it might be that for a small or medium-sized business, your incident response plan is just the phone numbers of the IT guy so that everyone knows that they can call the person to come in. That person might not even be a full-time employee, right? They may be a third party in and of themselves, but everyone should have their number so they can contact them if they notice something suspicious or click on a link. It doesn't have to be some large plan with a policy and a scope and applicability. For larger organizations, yeah, that's probably going to be the case. I think we've done a great job. Oh, go ahead.
Companies will be more formalized. A smaller company, I mean, one thing they all have to have in it and understand is what what would require them to make that contact. And, I mean, some companies can have a 3-page incident response plan. Some can have a 30.
And I think all this talk about incident response is important because, as we say in the industry, it's not a question of if something will go wrong, but when it will go wrong. Your ability to be prepared to respond is what is going to reduce your risk. And I think that's a huge factor here in the ever-expanding landscape of third-party and supply chain providers. We've spent a lot of time talking about the theoretical side of this, data classification, risk assessments, how to handle it. But if you were coming in, if you're a company who is doing none of this and you've been listening to us for almost 38 minutes here and hearing all this and going, wow, we really need to get started. What would be some basic steps that folks could take right from the start to get going on this process?
The first thing they should do is identify all third parties that are accessing, storing, or processing their data. That's step one. Get a list going, even if it's just an Excel document. Get a list. And then if you don't already, reach out to your business stakeholders and say, hey, you're using this company for this service. What data do they have? Sit down, have a meeting with them, walk through all of the data. Like say, even if you have to just throw it in an Excel sheet, get an idea of what is out there with the third parties that your company is using. And then from there, you can take it back to your internal security team and start, classifying and assigning risk. And then you all can make a plan forward of how you want to get a hold around your current suppliers. And then also moving forward, have some processes in place to assess before a contract is in place.
Lydia, what do you think?
I agree 100% with what Priscilla said. I'd like to add that your first step is also knowing your data. You can classify your data. That goes hand in hand with your third parties or that are accessing, storing, and processing that data. And your third-party risk management program, some might be a smaller program, some may be a large program. And it doesn't have to be overly complicated to start.
Exactly.
You just got to get off the ground and get moving.
Exactly.
I think that's a key piece, right? We've continued to talk about risk management. It really comes down to that not all data needs to be protected the same way, possibly. As we know in the industry, protecting data is expensive. It can be technology and people and processes and all kinds of stuff. And if the data isn't really as sensitive, you might apply less protections to it than the data that is more sensitive. Obviously, especially small and medium-sized businesses don't have a necessary lot of money to spend on cybersecurity. And so taking the smart route and protecting the data that's most important and critical is a great way to get started. That does come in from another question here we've just had. Is there a way to ballpark the investment in getting started in this process? Is it something that you need to pay $100,000 to get started on this, $500,000, $5? What does that maybe look like from an investment side?
I think the answer there is it depends. Again, it depends on the budget that you have, how many third parties you have, how detailed you want the assessments to be, how assured you want to be that these assessments captured everything you're looking for as far as protection. So like I said, it can be anywhere from $5 to $1 million. You know, it just depends on what your organization is looking to do.
And I think too, could this be something that you could just do yourself potentially?
Oh, absolutely. You know, if you have current security staff, then you can utilize them again. Just get them, you know, talking to this business stakeholders who typically may outsource services and say, hey, again, who are you using for this service? What type of data do they have? You don't need to, you know, necessarily go outside of your organization in order to get a program started. There's a lot of open source information out there to get you going.
I think that's a great point. When we were talking about assessments earlier, there are some that are simpler, like the NIST cybersecurity framework. There's also the NIST 853 series, which is a much larger and more verbose and in-depth version. There is the ISO 27001. There is some other compliance obligations like PCI DSS and HIPAA. There's the SIG standards. So there's lots of assessments that exist to help facilitate this. Of course, understanding what they mean and getting the most out of the responses is a key piece of the puzzle. But you're right, I think a large part of this is setting up the process and developing it, which does take us to another question that just came in, which is this something that you need to re-review third parties? You do just do this at the start, or kind of where does that fall?
I would say absolutely you need to have a review cycle with the third party. Depending on the type of data that they have would depend on, or how they scored in your risk assessment would depend on how often you reviewed them. But things can change within an organization. You know, they could have budget cuts and decide to cut out security that they don't feel are necessary.
Absolutely. And another way that you may be on monitoring the third party is if you did identify security gaps as a part of your assessment. And, you know, as we all know, being in the security field, not every gap can be remediated in a week or a month before the contract is signed. Sometimes you are asking third parties to put together large scale projects, and that does take time. So you want to be in communication with them throughout that project to ensure that the gap was closed. So you may set up periodic, you know, monthly check-ins. I mean, Lydia, weren't we on the phone all checking in? Where are you with this? What is the status? Is your project on schedule? So, you know, we kind of become a part of their organization at times when we do have security gaps that we are monitoring.
Yeah, and all in an attempt to drive down that risk, right?
One example is encryption of data at rest. That seemed to take a long time with a lot of third parties, especially smaller companies, because it's very expensive and it's big and it's in areas, and
well, we are almost out of time here.
New contract with before that was finished.
That's right. We've seen it.
We're almost out of time here. I will take some closing thoughts from both of you. Lydia, if you'd like to go first, you know, final recommendations for folks who are getting into this or looking to tune up their programs and be better at it.
Be open-minded. And always know your data. And definitely, as we said before, no project is too small to assess. It's not going to hurt you to assess a company that is small and storing a small amount of data. Not only know what their practices are, but know who accesses data from that third party.
Priscilla?
That's right. I mean, Lydia captured most of it. The only thing I would add is, again, don't be afraid to get started. It can be intimidating to think about, retroactively assessing all the third parties you're using, but just with a strategy, try to prioritize, even if you're just starting off with a handful, to get your feet wet in the process. Just get started, get a hold of who are your third parties, and then you'll find that, it'll go smoothly from there.
That was great. Well, that is all the time that we have today. I want to thank both Lydia and Priscilla for joining us and providing their insights around third-party risk management. I hope you found their stories and experiences useful as I did. In the meantime, make sure to sign up for our next event at www.hivesystems.io/HiveLive. Next month, we will be having a workshop around SPF records, DKIM, and DMARC. If you don't know what those are, then your company's emails are probably not getting delivered, and you're putting your company's security and reputation at risk. So make sure you don't miss it and sign up at www.hivesystems.io/HiveLive. Until next time, thank you very much. And remember, when it comes to cybersecurity, you need to act and not react. Have a great evening.